children, your grandchildren walk through that door to try to claim that prize. Now, before you answer that easy question, what if I told you that in order to receive the prize, they've got to make it out of the room safely? That adds a little bit of a twist to it, but still, we're talking about a $1 million prize at the end of the day. Now, what if I told you 85 to 88% of children don't make it out alive? All of a sudden, it takes on a whole different aspect, doesn't it? Because suddenly, we're talking about your son, your daughter, your grandchildren, and I don't think there's anybody in this room that would risk those kinds of odds. And yet, we're doing it every single year. We send our kids off to college after a pursuit of, let's face it, higher incomes. And yet the reality is we're losing 85 to 88% of them when they go off to that university. Because quite literally, folks, they're not prepared for what's coming. We've got to inoculate them. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I mean we line them all up and give them shots? Well, yes, sort of, kind of. But a different kind of shot. Let me share with you what I mean by that. I'm raising 4 children, not to be just Christians. I'm raising 4 children who I want to be warriors for Christ. There is a difference. And when I send my children off to college, I don't hope that they remain faithful. No, I want my children converting other people to Christ. See, there's a difference in the mindset, isn't there? There's one mindset that says, well, you know, I'm going to send them off and I hope they make it. No. If I've done my job by the time they hit 18, they'll make it. The question is, who are they going to bring along with them? Have you instilled in them a belief system that will stick? Let me share with you an experiment that was performed at University of California several years ago. They wanted to find out how hard is it to get a group of young people to give up something they believe in. They were looking at basically how tightly anchored are our beliefs and what is required in order for us to let them go. They didn't want to mess with religion because they did not want to mess with these kids' belief system in that area, so they chose something that they thought would be less damaging. They decided they would conduct an experiment to see if they could get these kids to give up brushing their teeth. So here's the experiment. They had 6 groups. We're going to say, just for the lack of giving you all the numbers, that each group had 100 people in it. So you've got an experiment with 600 young people. They paid an actor to come in and to convince those kids to give up their toothbrush. He started out wearing this nice white starch lab coat, lots of initials after his name. He was in an amphitheater room there on the university, had all kinds of slides and PowerPoints to show them. Here's how the research experiment went. Group number 1, first 100 students, they didn't get anything. No warning, no nothing. They just sent them in blind. And this guy started his spiel. He told them how that toothpaste was realistically cancer-causing, and that the bristles on the brush actually would cause pits in their teeth where bacteria would grow. And he went on, and basically, by the end of his hour, he had convinced these kids the worst thing they could do for their mouth was brush their teeth. And most of them gave up their toothbrush. The second group, right before they sent them in, they gave them a reminder. They gathered them up. They said, you know, we have told you from birth that brushing your teeth is a good thing, that you're supposed to brush twice a day. And then they sent them in the room. The guy went through his same spiel, and sure enough, at the end of the day, most of them, they gave up their toothbrush. Group number 3, they gave them the reminder that they needed to brush their teeth, but they also warned them. They said, hey, we're about to send you into this room where there's going to be a guy who tries to get you to give up your toothbrush. Sent him in. He did his spiel. He used his graphs and his color pictures, and lo and behold, guess what? Most of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 4, they got the reminder. They got the warning that they were fixing to go into this room where this guy was going to try to make them give up their toothbrush, but they also got some of the guy's arguments. They said, you know what? He may try to tell you that the toothpaste causes cancer. He may try to tell you that the bristles on the brush are causing pits that bacteria can grow in. They sent them in. And again, many of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 5, they got the reminder. They were warned. They got the guy's arguments, but they also got answers to the guy's arguments. They said, you know what? He's going to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer, but he's not going to tell you that it's not in your mouth long enough to even worry about. He's going to tell you that the bristles on a toothbrush can cause these pits, but he's not going to tell you that enamel is one of the toughest substances on the planet and that soft toothbrush won't do anything to it. And they sent them in. The last group, group number 6, got all of that. They got the reminder, they got the warnings, they got the arguments, they got answers to the guy's arguments, but right before they sent them in, they gathered all the students together and they said, look, this guy may throw some things at you that we haven't talked about. He may use some arguments that we have not discussed, but that doesn't change the very real fact that brushing your teeth is good for you. They encouraged them to think. They encouraged them to really critically evaluate what the guy was saying. And then they sent them in. Now, if I were to ask you which group did the best, obviously group number 6. Because, folks, they were inoculated. If I asked you which group did the worst, most of you would probably say group 1. Nope, that's not right. It's actually group number 2. Group number 2, the group that just got that reminder. You know, we've told you since birth. You say, Brad, why in the world? Why are you up there talking to us about brushing teeth? Folks, listen to me. If an actor can get our kids to give up a toothbrush in 1 hour, you think about what a professor can do in a semester. And yet, here's the interesting thing. That second group, the group that was just given the reminder, the group that did the worst, folks, that's what we're doing in the church. We look at our kids and we say, you know, we've told you since birth that there's a God. Now you go off and get your degree. And they sit in that class day after day after day, and they give up their toothbrush. We need to learn how to inoculate our kids. Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, made the statement, it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. I probably just said a word that we're not supposed to say in somebody's household. I apologize for that. But folks, look at that quote for just a moment through the eyes of an 18-year-old, through the eyes of a 20-year-old who was sitting in a class and he starts to buy into this idea that all intelligent people believe evolution. Now, let's be honest for just a moment. Everybody in this room, if we're totally honest with ourselves, most teenagers by the age of 16, they've taken some kind of potion that makes them think mom and dad are dumb. Okay? I'm not giving my kids that potion. But most kids do. They believe their parents aren't really smart. Well, by 18, they're convinced that they're insane. And all of a sudden, they're sitting in front of this guy that's got degrees and he's got white coats and everything that's coming out of his mouth they believe is the truth. And they want to be just like him. And this guy's telling them, hey, you want to be just like me? Here's what you need to believe. The sad part is, the guy in the white coat, the guy with a lot of initials after his name, That guy that is standing on the shoulders of giants who've come before him has completely overlooked the belief system of scientists who he can't hold the shoes to. Men like, for instance, Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton, the man who did amazing work in physics, calculus. Those of you who didn't like math, this would be the guy you want to kick in the shin. This is the guy who performed experiments in astronomy. He studied the tides. In fact, he was considered probably the greatest scientist that has ever walked the earth. And yet, ironically, Isaac Newton wrote strong papers refuting atheism and defending creation and the Bible. In fact, Newton said, I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than any profane history whatsoever. But folks, Newton's not alone. We look at Johann Kepler, the founder of the field of astronomy, the guy who quite literally kicked off the field that has been hijacked by Big Bang theorists. Johann Kepler said, astronomy was thinking God's thoughts after him. In fact, it was Kepler who went on to say, I see how God is also gloried by my endeavors in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. How about Blaise Pascal? Blaise Pascal, a man who studied differential calculus, hydrostatics. In fact, it was Blaise Pascal who came up with the famous Pascal wager that basically says, how can anybody lose who chooses to be a Christian? What do you mean, Pascal? Well, let's think for just a moment. If you're an atheist and I'm a Christian, and there is no God, neither one of us lose anything. But if you're an atheist and I'm a Christian and there is a God, you've lost everything. Did you notice, though, in both situations, if I take the Christian position, I never lose. How about Robert Boyle? Some of you may remember studying chemistry, Boyle's constant, father of modern chemistry. This guy was considered to be one of the most greatest physical scientists of all time. But it was Robert Boyle who also did things like funded mission work. He translated the Bible into foreign tongues, but here's the one that those professors aren't going to talk to our kids about. This guy set up in his will that a set of lectures be held every single year. They're called the Boyle Lectures. Now, you would think the father of chemistry would want to have annual lectures on chemistry, right? No, the Boyle Lectures are for proving the Christian religion. And folks, think for just a moment about what I'm showing you. Richard Dawkins says, if you don't believe in evolution, you're either ignorant, stupid, or insane. And yet Richard Dawkins could not hold the shoes of these men. How about Nicholas Steno, John Woodward, the fathers of geology? You know what they considered themselves? Flood geologists. We go to Carol Linnaeus. He was the guy who came up with all the different kinds. He's the guy that came up with the Latin naming system. He's the guy that I would like to kick in the shins. I was in general biology, and we had to memorize a lot of those. My favorite, you know, humans are Homo sapiens. You like this one. The rat, Rattus rattus. That was an easy one to remember. And yet, here you've got a guy who says the reason he started that field was to try to discover the original Genesis kinds. We go to Samuel B. Morse of Morse code fame. Here you've got a guy who is inventing the telegraph. And yet the very first thing he sent across that telegraph was Numbers chapter 23:23. What hath God wrought? You see, folks, they're duping our kids. They're trying to teach our kids that if you believe in God, if you cling to any kind of religion, that you are weak-minded, that you need a crutch. And yet some of the most brilliant minds of all time most definitely believe in God. Samuel B. Morse, he went on to say, the nearer I approach the end of my pilgrimage, the clearer is the evidence of the divine origin of the Bible. We look, for instance, at Joseph Henry, a physicist who invented the electromagnetic motor, the first director of the Smithsonian Institute. Why would I show you this guy? Because, folks, if you've been to the Smithsonian lately, you know it's been hijacked by evolutionists. It is a shrine to Darwinism. And yet, the very first director, he was a man who prayed before he conducted research experiments. We look at 19th century scientists like Louis Agassiz, George Stokes, Gregory Mendel, Louis Pasteur, Henry Fabre. All of these folks were founders in their fields. And yet in most of those fields, sadly, it has been hijacked by evolutionists. Lord Kelvin of the Kelvin temperature system. James Clerk Maxwell. Some of you probably don't remember this guy. James Clerk Maxwell was a guy who Albert Einstein called his achievement the most profound, the most fruitful that physics has ever experienced. Now, if Einstein's saying that about you, that means you probably accomplished something. What exactly did this guy do? Mathematically, he refuted the evolutionary nebular hypothesis that we're still teaching today, and he scientifically refuted Darwinism. And yet Einstein said that his achievement was the most profound, the most fruitful that physics has experienced since Newton. How about Sir Ambrose Fleming? Most of you remember the name of Fleming. What you may not remember is this guy was a Christian apologist. And yet, again, his field has been taken over by people who don't believe in a God. What about modern day examples? For instance, we've got people like George Washington Carver, who believed in a God. We got people like Wilbur and Orville Wright, who most definitely believed in God. We got people like, for instance, Wernher von Braun, one of the directors of NASA. And yet, what are our kids hearing? Our kids are hearing all intelligent people believe evolution. Let me give you one last example, because I think this one is probably the most, to me, it's the strongest. It's a fellow by the name of Michael Faraday. And again, you might recognize Faraday's constant. Those of you who had physics, probably one of the greatest experimental physicists of all time. He knew more about magnets and motors than any of us will ever want to know. I want to share with you a very real incident that was happening with Michael Faraday. He was giving a lecture, and during that lecture, he was in front of the future king. Here's what happened. A crowded gathering of distinguished scientists had been listening spellbound to the masterly expositions of Michael Faraday. For an hour, he had held his brilliant audience enthralled as he demonstrated the nature and the properties of the magnet. He had brought his lecture to a close with an experiment so novel, so bewildering, and so triumphant that for some time after he resumed his seat, the house was rocked with enthusiastic applause. The Prince of Wales, the man who would become King Edward VII, he rose to propose a motion of congratulations. The resolution, having been duly seconded, was carried out with a renewed round of applause. Everybody was excited because the future king just recognized this man. They wanted to know, what's he going to say? So suddenly it got quiet. Silence settled over the entire audience. Everybody wanted to know, what is Michael Faraday's response going to be? And yet he didn't reply. In fact, he did not even appear, because only his most intimate friends knew what had become of him. For you see, this man was an elder in a little Sandemanian church. The hour at which he concluded his lecture was the hour at which they had their weekly prayer meeting. He had disappeared out the side door. Because this man, folks, he was not concerned with the praises of men. He was concerned with obeying Jehovah God. That's where we've got to get. Our kids need to understand that even though textbooks are diligent in trying to tell them that evolution is a fact, that realistically, that's rubbish. The textbook that you see on the screen, there's a little bit of background I'll give you about it, was copyrighted in the year 2000. They got their hands slapped for saying that evolution is a fact, not a theory. Because technically you can't say that. So we fast forward to the year 2007 to a new textbook that is currently being used today. A new textbook, and I want you to listen very carefully to what they're teaching in this particular textbook. I'm going to actually read it. I'll blow it up for you so that you can see it. But they're talking about scientific discoveries may be broadly categorized into 4 groups: facts, hypotheses, laws, and theories. Notice this: in order of increasing importance. So now, accordingly, theories are more important than laws and facts, folks. In other words, if you won't let us call evolution a fact, we'll just change the category of a theory to supersede that. Well, let's see how that's working for them. For instance, if we were to look at this through the mind's eye of a young person, what is it exactly that they're not being told about this theory? For instance, how many young people today are being told that evolution can't explain how we got life from non-life? Or evolution can't explain the very existence of matter, the origin of the universe. It can't explain design. Because, folks, if you've got design, guess what you also have? You've got a designer. Now, evolution can't explain that, but there is something out there that can. That's called the creation model. We talked yesterday a little bit about some of the things that evolution struggles with. Can't explain the origin of sex and gender. It can't explain the origin of language, the origin of consciousness, and yet they continue to force it down our kids' throats. Well, let's take a look at exactly how good the evidence is for it. We'll start with some examples. For instance, you open basically any textbook today, and you're going to see what I call icons of evolution. That is, these are pillars that are in almost every biology textbook. Yes, moms and dads, they're still there. I actually had one of my office people scan for me several of the latest textbooks. These are copyrighted 2011. Yes, these little peppered moths, they're in there. Here's the story our kids hear. If you look on the screen, you'll notice there are actually 2 moths there. And they tell our kids that prior to the industrial age, there used to be 95% light, 5% dark. Because the birds could easily spot the dark ones, they'd eat them off the trees. But then after the industrial age, the soot, the ash from all of the factories settled onto the trees, and lo and behold, now we got 95% dark, 5% light. They say the population shifted, and they call this evolution in action. It looks convincing. The only problem with it is, number one, those moths don't rest on tree trunks. You say, whoa, time out, Brad, back up. You just showed us moths resting on tree trunks. Yeah, those are either dead or they've been glued or pinned there. In fact, in over 40 years of research, they've only found a handful resting on tree trunks. Number 2, the moths don't choose a matching background. Number 3, most importantly, the guy who did the original research, his name is Kettlewell. Nobody's been able to replicate his original findings. You know what we call that in science? Garbage. And yet I want you to read with me what a textbook writer had to say when asked the question, why are we still using these recycled pictures of dead moths on trees? Why are we lying to students? Take a look at what he said. His name is Bob Ritter. He said, you have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? The advantage of this example of natural selection is that it's extremely visual. We want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, they, talking about high school students, can look at the work critically. In other words, later on you can discern if it's true or not, but it sells the picture we want it to sell. All right? What about these guys? Most of you in this room that had a biology course, you probably remember these embryos, the pictures. If we were to start looking here at the bottom left, we've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a couple of mammals, and a human being at 3 different stages of development. If you look across that top row, what you're going to notice is basically all of those creatures look the same. And they were drawn that way on purpose. Because the man who drew them, Ernst Haeckel, he bought into the idea that we all came from a common ancestor. He said his turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species. In fact, those of you who really know your history, you know this guy visited Charles Darwin at his home there on the Mount. They exchanged some ideas. Ernst Haeckel made these drawings. Folks, the problem is he completely forged them. He lied. In fact, he got kicked out of the university he was working at for forging the pictures. You say, okay, Brad, what's the big deal? Surely we don't use them 150 years later. Oh yeah, we've colorized them. We make them prettier now because they're selling the same message we want to sell. Top row, you see Ernst Haeckel's pictures. At the bottom row, you see the real McCoy. Again, folks, listen to me. They're not interested in our kids actually learning the truth. They're interested in our kids being indoctrinated by a godless theory. Stephen Jay Gould wrote an article in Natural History magazine many years ago. Let me point out, Stephen Jay Gould is not a religious guy. He was a staunch evolutionist. He called his article atrocious. He was addressing the fact that we're still using these embryos. Take a look at what he said. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. Mindless recycling? Oh yeah. How about this one? Horse evolution. Again, this is a staple in the textbooks. Most all of your kids have probably seen images just like this one. The idea that we started out with this little bitty creature and it has evolved up into the modern day horse. Stop right there. Let's think about this logically. If we started out with this little guy and we're getting bigger through time, could somebody please tell me why we have little mice? Why haven't they evolved into these gigantic things? Because that's what they're teaching. And can you imagine the size of a Clydesdale in about 2 million years? Folks, they're completely ignoring the evidence. Oh, they're quick to put it in a textbook, absolutely. Listen to what Harrub Nielsen said. The family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. He said, in the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from 3 parts, of which only the last can be described as including horses. Now, here's what I want everybody to notice. He said that all the way back in 1954. We've known for over 50 years, folks, that this whole schematic of the horses, that's just a joke. George Gaylord Simpson, he put it beautifully. He said, the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracothrium, that little bitty guy, into Equus, the modern day horse, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. What about this one? Vestigial structures. Another staple of evolution. The idea that right now, as you're sitting there listening to me, you've got evolutionary byproducts in your body. You've got baggage. And yet, we still use it to teach evolution. You open a textbook and they say something like, vestigial structures are remnants of an organism's evolutionary past. And you say, Brad, that's a funny word. I've never heard it. What are you talking about exactly? Well, let's see. Think like your appendix, your little toe, your tonsils. If you think you don't need your little toe, try cutting it off and walking around. Don't do it. 1931, it was reported that we had over 180 vestigial organs. That list has basically been reduced down to nothing. Why? Because we know they have a function today. I'll share with you guys very quickly a progression that we saw in the textbooks. We go all the way back to 1989. Vestigial organs are still being trumpeted as proof for evolution. They use the appendix. We fast forward just a little bit to 1994. They've got a picture of the human appendix and that of a horse, still claiming that this is proof for evolution. That's 1994. 1998, Goyer's Encyclopedia reports, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Its removal increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. Oh, you mean it has a function? Folks, when I was a young child, you got strep throat 5 or 6 times in a row, guess what they did? Out came your tonsils. They're not as quick to do that anymore. You know why? Because we realize that's the very first, the primary site for immune function in the pharynx. I was down in New Zealand several years ago, was having a debate with a guy. He was a surgeon, he was an atheist. Right in the middle of the debate, I set the guy up on purpose. I began to ask, his name was Dr. Joe. I said, Dr. Joe, could you please, this was a 3-hour televised debate. I said, could you please tell the viewing audience out there where the original matter for the universe came from? He kind of looked over at me, looked down at the floor. He said, we don't know that. I said, that's okay, no worries. How about this? Could you please then tell the folks out there how we went from a gaseous rock to having that first living cell? He looked down, he said, well, we're not sure about that either. I said, no worries. How about this? Could you tell me how that first cell, all those parts came together? When the first law of thermodynamics says that everything should be, or the second law says everything should be going apart towards chaos. By now, I kid you not, folks, he was staring at his shoes. He was slumped over. He said, well, we don't know that either. I kept on him for about 3 or 4 more questions, and then I switched gears on him, and I said, hey, Dr. Joe, have you ever seen the brachial plexus? It's a nerve plexus. Sits right up under your armpit. It's one of the largest nerve plexus you've got in your body. Looks like a huge spider web. He perked back up. He said, absolutely. I said, so you've actually seen this massive nerve plexus? He said, absolutely I have. He said, I've even done surgery on it. I said, so you've seen the design of this nerve plexus? He said, yeah, I've seen the design. And as soon as that left his lips, he realized what he just said. And he immediately crawfished on me. He said, but the human body's got all kinds of vestigial organs that prove evolution. And I smiled real big. Have I told you guys I like my job? I told him, I said, you know, you've had medical training, and I've had medical training. How about we take these cameras, we take them into a sterile operating suite, and I'll cut out all of your vestigial organs. He didn't want to do that. Why? Because, folks, God don't make junk. R.O.Y. song, he summed it up this way. He said, not too long ago, man was imputed to have 180 vestiges. Organs like the appendix, the tonsils, the thymus, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, they were all on the list. Today, all former vestigial organs are known to have some function during the life of the individual. If the organ has any function at any time, it cannot be called rudimentary or vestigial. As man's knowledge has increased, the list of vestigial organs has decreased. So what really was vestigial? Was it not man's rudimentary knowledge of the intricacies of the body? Folks, just because we don't know something doesn't mean it's a byproduct of evolution. Maybe we ought to actually humble ourselves and realize we don't know everything. I got a lot more but the guy that I paid to take the clock off the wall in the back did not show up tonight. Folks, you see the problem? Our kids are being told out of one side that in order to be intelligent, they need to buy into this thing, but they're never seeing the truth. They're not really examining the evidence. I'll go back to what I started with. We must inoculate our kids. It's not just enough to pat them on the head and say, now, you run along, you're supposed to believe in God when you go off to school. We've told you that since you were born. Folks, that's not enough anymore. What we've got to do is we have got to inoculate them with their arguments, answers to their arguments, and we've got to give them logic. You know, there was a time, a golden era, so to speak, 60, 70 years ago, when all you needed to know was it's in the Bible, that's it, period, we're done. Now don't, make sure you hear me, what I'm saying. We're still done. But our kids need the evidence for why they believe what they believe. Church, if we're not giving them that, we're losing the battle. And I can give you name after name after name tonight of young people who grew up. They were here every Sunday morning. They were here on Wednesday night. They know about Abraham. They know about Sarah. They know about Noah. But now they know a whole lot more about evolution than they ever learned about this book. Because we didn't inoculate them. Tonight, I want to ask you, have you been inoculated? Do you really know what the truth is? This week we're learning about Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the theme on redemption. The part that we need to keep focusing on and the part that we need to keep hammering is the fact that, folks, all of the Bible does not make any sense without the scheme of redemption. If you take out Genesis 3, the fall of man, sin, if you take that away and you say maybe we just evolved up out of some primordial pool of sludge, where does that leave the gift of Calvary? Again, I don't know everybody and everybody's situation here tonight, but I know this. I know eventually I've got to get on an airplane, I've got to go back home, and I've got to lay my head on a pillow, and I want to be able to tell God I did everything I could. That I did everything I could to try to help you to learn the truth. Folks, once I try to teach you the truth, the responsibility shifts from my shoulders to your shoulders with what you will do with that truth. Tonight I'm asking you, what will you do with it? Evolution is a lie. Creation is the truth. Creation by a God who loved you enough to send His Son. If you believe that, and you're ready to repent of your sins, to confess His name, to be immersed for the remission of your sins, what are you waiting on? For those of us who are Christians, I hope and I pray that you will think long and hard about where your children, where your grandchildren are in life right now. And I hope and pray that you will not stop fighting for their souls. Because I promise you this, Satan's not going to stop. If you realize that you've kind of let the reins go, or you've allowed your Christian light to grow dim, tonight is the night to change that. If you realize that maybe you haven't been the parent, the grandparent you need to be, I'm asking you to step forward. As together we stand and we sing.
There's gladness in believing in Jesus, there is love.